My Govanen, welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and after I put out my video on character flaws of some of Tolkien's heroes in The Lord of the Rings, I got some interesting comments, and probably the most interesting one was about Gandalf's real character flaw being the fact that he's basically just a Machiavellian schemer who gets everybody else to do the dirty work and basically just manipulates people into dangerous situations and all this other stuff. And somebody else commented after that, talking about the fact that, Denethor's criticisms ring pretty true or something to that effect. And so I decided, let's actually make a video talking about that, because this is just clearly not true. And if you're coming away from the book with this kind of sense about who Gandalf is, then you're really missing something big. You could criticize Gandalf for a lot of things, like being a little slow on the uptake about the ring, being slow on the uptake about more than just the ring, or whatever. But to accuse him of being somebody who's just manipulating everybody around him to do dangerous things is really kind of unfair. So let's take a look at Gandalf's meddling in Middle-earth and see how it actually shapes up in terms of what it means for his character. So first off, of course, we have the story of the Hobbit, which is very much due to Gandalf's meddling in a lot of ways, and we get a couple of different versions of this story, in a sense, because we get the Hobbit version of the story, which is told very much from Bilbo's perspective, and then we get the story as told by Gandalf in very short form in Minas Tirith, in the appendices of The Lord of the Rings, where we get some information about his main motivations for making sure that this quest got off the ground and hopefully succeeded. In the Hobbit version, of course, we get Bilbo being kind of shocked by Gandalf's very appearance, and then he gets kind of literally almost pushed out his own door and just kind of goes along for the ride, and the next thing you know, he's in the middle of a bunch of dangerous adventures. Now, from this perspective, of course, it is very much true that Gandalf had a more than merely persuasive role in getting Bilbo to go on this quest, which of course was extremely dangerous and nearly cost him his life a couple of times, more than a couple of times. And therefore, you could say that Gandalf in this version of the story is, basically just disregarding Bilbo's safety and, hoping that he comes out okay, just not really caring, though, enough to make sure that he just stays safe in his hobbit hole. But even in the Hobbit version of the story, it becomes very clear, I think, to any, attentive reader, that Gandalf's role in the story is to give Bilbo a push, but there is, there's definitely something in Bilbo that wants to do it anyway, and also it is for Bilbo's own good, and Gandalf knows that it's for Bilbo's own good, but also there's an element of, this is something that is more important than just Bilbo. This becomes much clearer when we get Gandalf's version of the story in Minas Tirith, and we get a bunch of information about some of the backstory, how he meets Thorin, the discussions he has with Thorin and other dwarves, and, the dwarves asking him for help, and him basically telling them, look, you need to get, a hobbit, basically, to help you finish this quest. And in this version of the story, Gandalf says, I don't even know why I said that. And of course, the implication here is it was very much a providential type of thing, where Gandalf was kind of being prodded along by Providence to make sure that a hobbit went along on this quest. And of course, it turns out for very good reason, because the hobbit, as a species, is much more sneaky than a dwarf, doesn't smell like a dwarf, which means Smaug isn't going to be like, there's a dwarf around. And there's a lot of other advantages too. And of course, the main reason why Gandalf goes and tries to accomplish this whole thing is because, as we even get in Peter Jackson's version of the story in the movies, he's trying to make sure that the dragon Smaug is not a player on the board should Sauron take power again and try to wipe out Middle-earth. So it's not merely about giving an adventure to Bilbo and getting the dwarves back into their kingdom. It is also about the very long-term prospects of how are we going to make sure Middle-earth survives the next attack by Sauron. So he has motives that go to the very, very survival of, the free peoples of Middle-earth as free peoples. And that's a big deal, but also it's not as if he's just going in saying, okay, we have this really important goal, and I am just going to find somebody that I can shoehorn into a role that we need to finish this quest and accomplish what we want, and therefore, okay, well, I need a hobbit. Who am I going to pick? I'm just going to pick Bilbo because. And he then just puts Bilbo into a position that Bilbo doesn't really want to be in. No, he's actually following the promptings of somebody higher than himself and getting, not direct messages in that sense, but at least promptings in some way that he needs to include Bilbo or some similar hobbit in this quest so that it will succeed. And he doesn't himself know exactly why. So when you step back and look at it from this perspective, you can see that Gandalf is not the schemer here. If anybody is the Machiavellian schemer in this whole thing, it is Eru Ilúvatar, or arguably the Valar, but I would say probably more likely Ilúvatar. But that's not exactly Machiavellian, because if Eru Ilúvatar, who is God, is the one who is doing the scheming, then of course he can make sure that things actually do turn out for the best for, whoever's involved, to the extent that they're willing to let him make sure that things turn out for the best. So, for example, Thorin doesn't let things turn out for the best for him because he gets greedy and doesn't really come around until too late, and then he ends up getting killed in the battle. Whereas if he had been smart about it in the, initial stages, that might not have happened. He might have survived because they might have all had a united front at the beginning, and then the goblins might have not been able to actually kill Thorin. Who knows? That's a topic for another day. Point being, if, God, who is, kind of planning everything, is the schemer in this case, you can't really call God Machiavellian. The Machiavellian schemer is one who is just using other people for his own ends regardless of the outcome, but God is the one who makes the outcome, so it's not regardless of the outcome. And God, of course, does know best, so there's no way to really accuse Ilúvatar here of being a Machiavellian schemer, and if he's the one that's doing the planning, well, there you go. Next, of course, we get the Lord of the Rings story, and Gandalf has a lot of, let's say, meddling going on in all of this. He, of course, meddles to some extent to get Frodo to take off on his quest. He meddles to some extent to get Bilbo to give up the ring. He meddles in Rohan to get Theoden to, kind of turn himself around and stop listening to Grima Wormtongue. He meddles with Denethor to some extent, although Denethor is extremely resistant to meddling. There's a lot of meddling that goes on by, those kind of standards in The Lord of the Rings by Gandalf. Some of which we get, actually directly in the story. Some of it we get as, references by characters to previous things that Gandalf has done. All this kind of stuff. Denethor will directly accuse Gandalf of meddling and say, you put Pippin in this situation where he's next to me all the time so that he can spy for you, and your whole plan is to supplant me with Aragorn, this ranger from the north. And Gandalf doesn't actually have Pippin in there as a spy. He doesn't stop Pippin from joining up with, Theoden's guard, or whatever you want to call it, but he doesn't prompt him to do it for sure in the book. And in the movie, of course, they change that up, and he's actually directly opposed to the idea. But at least in the book, he is not opposed to it. But we never get him saying anything like, "Oh, by the way, tell me what's going on in Denethor's chamber when I'm not around." And he's also, I'm sure that Gandalf would actually like to see Aragorn on the throne because he knows that Aragorn is a better man than Denethor. But he's not scheming, as far as we can tell, in any way to accomplish this. And he also tells Denethor, which is perfectly true, your honor is not diminished if you give up your rule in favor of the one who has the right to actually claim it over you. That's actually your job as a steward. That's actually doing the right thing as your role, and therefore that's more honorable for you. But at any rate, Denethor is one of the people who directly accuses him of stuff like this. Grima Wormtongue will do much the same thing. He will basically say, you're always asking for our help, and you're the one who comes along and picks the bones after the battle and all this other stuff. And so we've got characters who actually directly accuse Gandalf of meddling in less than, beneficent ways, I suppose. And so they're basically accusing him of being a malefactor in some way. He's a bad actor. He's doing things for his own ends. And this is really, of course, the key thing about a Machiavellian is the Machiavellian is out for himself. That's kind of the point. If you're scheming in a Machiavellian way, you're doing it to, benefit yourself somehow. And is Gandalf ever meddling to benefit himself? Now, of course, in The Lord of the Rings, we learn a lot more about who Gandalf is, and we eventually learn, even more in Unfinished Tales, but one of the things that we know about Gandalf is that he was sent to Middle-earth as an emissary from the Valar to help the peoples of Middle-earth fight against Sauron. That is literally his job. And Gandalf's role in that is to encourage the free peoples to do what they should be doing and to give them kind of the inspiration and courage to do it. That's kind of who he is as a character. As a result, you could twist that into saying that it's a Machiavellian scheming thing because he's manipulating other people to get into dangerous situations. But let's look at each of the dangerous situations that these different characters that he manipulates get into. Frodo gets into a dangerous situation because he goes off on a quest to try to destroy the ring. Well, let's see. If Gandalf didn't actually get him, Gandalf doesn't directly persuade Frodo. It's not like he tells Frodo, here's what you should do and why. He gives Frodo information and lets Frodo make up his own decision. I mean, that's hardly a Machiavellian schemer. You can argue that he gives him just the information that makes him most likely to do what he wants, but even if you want to do that, let's look at what would have actually happened if he didn't. If Gandalf didn't intervene at all, what would have happened to Frodo? The day he would have left, if he didn't leave, the Black Riders would have come to Bag End, and they would have killed Frodo outright and taken the ring, and then everything would have been over. So is Gandalf actually doing Frodo a disservice by getting him to do what he ought to do anyway? No, he actually saved his life, barely. If anything, he was less urgent than he should have been getting Frodo to leave. He waited too long because he almost got Frodo caught at his own front door. So that's one. What about another one? Well, like we said, he got Bilbo to give up the One Ring. Now, he gets Bilbo to give up the One Ring voluntarily because he had already promised to do it. And does that hurt Bilbo? No, it actually helps Bilbo in the end because he stops being possessed by the ring, as Gandalf puts it. Does that endanger Bilbo in any way? No. Does it endanger Frodo? Yes, but, it would have endangered Bilbo if he'd kept it. So, it's like it's going to endanger somebody. And, again, the Black Riders show up at Bag End whether Bilbo passes it on or not. So, it's still for the better. And then you can argue that he plays some role in getting Frodo to actually accept the quest in Rivendell and take the ring to then, take it to Mordor ultimately. Is that him scheming like a Machiavellian? Well, no. Somebody has to take the ring. Is anybody else better qualified to take the ring? No. Does he push Frodo into this decision? No. You can't really look at anything that gets said in the council or before that indicates that Gandalf is pushing Frodo in that direction. In fact, he tells Frodo directly, I hope it won't be your part, or that it may not be your part to carry, the ring any further than Rivendell. that basically is Gandalf saying, there's nothing tying you to this, for an indefinite period. Your goal is to get to Rivendell, and that's it for now. And then Frodo decides on his own to take the ring. And it's because he feels, again, sort of the weight of Providence saying, you got to do this. And then Elrond backs that up by saying, I wouldn't choose this quest for you, but if you choose it, I think you made the right choice. So Elrond is basically backing up that whole idea of Providence seems to have picked you for this. So again, it's not Gandalf doing anything. He meddles in Rohan, but if he doesn't meddle in Rohan, what happens? Isengard gets stronger, conquers Rohan, things go bad. What did Gandalf do or not do that was so bad in that context? And we've already looked a little bit at Denethor. He doesn't actually tell Pippin to spy. He's not actually directly doing anything to get Aragorn to just overthrow Denethor. Now, obviously, in Gandalf's opinion, Aragorn has a right to the throne, and Denethor ought to surrender it, but it never even comes to the point where that decision has to be made, because by that stage, Denethor is suicidal, takes his own life, and we never have to see that happen. And we also never even really see Gandalf trying to persuade him, other than in that one scene where Denethor brings it up himself, seemingly out of nowhere. But, I mean, we know what Denethor's problem is. Denethor's problem is he is all about himself, and he is very much not to say that he is suspicious of Gandalf and anybody connected with Gandalf would be to put it far too mildly. Denethor has had a long-standing inferiority complex because of Thorongil, aka Aragorn, being kind of the more awesome person of the two of them way back when he was younger. And as a result, he just really doesn't psychologically handle any of this stuff well, because he sees people weaving webs around him in all kinds of ways. And part of this is because he goes kind of insane at the end as well, but it's not just that. I mean, this is a guy who's paranoid. And he's paranoid because he is so focused on keeping his own power and not giving it up. When you're in a position like that, and your main goal is not the good of the society you rule, but rather maintaining the power that you have to do that, you are, of course, going to see other people as constantly scheming against you. That's just kind of the nature of the beast. That's why in Soviet Russia you had Stalin purge a whole bunch of people who he thought were rivals, or at least potential rivals, so that they couldn't, revolt against him and stage a coup. This is how power works when it's that consumed with its own, for its own sake, right? When people hold power and they just want it for its own sake, this is how they act. It's just, for whatever reason, that's human psychology. So Denethor is seeing ghosts. He's not really seeing what's actually going on. He's imputing all of this stuff to Gandalf, but there's no actual evidence Gandalf has done any of this. What has Gandalf done to intervene in Minas Tirith? In the book, he doesn't light the beacons or get Pippin to do it. It was already done by the time he got there, and Denethor had already sent a messenger to Theoden asking him to come and help. What does he actually do in Minas Tirith? He offers counsel, he offers his advice, and he actually helps in the defense of the city, but what is he trying to persuade Denethor to do at the end of the day? I mean, really, think about it. It's not that much. And I kind of wonder how much of this comment was based on movie Denethor and movie Gandalf and not the actual book versions of the characters. Because in the movie, it's a lot easier to make that argument, because you do have Gandalf doing things proactively, like getting Pippin to light the beacons, which apparently Denethor is against for reasons that make absolutely no sense at all. But at any rate, the point being, Gandalf in the movie actually does things against Denethor's will, whereas in the book, it doesn't really happen. It just doesn't. Denethor is making all this stuff up in his head. He's dreaming all this. So there's really not any cases where we can look at what Gandalf does and say, oh yeah, he totally just did that and put this person in danger for his own selfish ends. And you can't even really say that even if you take the selfish ends part out of it, right, and say Gandalf is doing this, he's going for like the greater good, but he's doing it in a way that is just endangering all these other people who wouldn't have been endangered otherwise. No. All of these people would have been in massive danger regardless of whether they did what Gandalf wanted them to do. Frodo, like I said, would have been killed at Bag End by Black Riders, whether he took the ring or not, if he didn't get out of there in time. Theoden would have been overrun in Rohan if he hadn't turned around and done what Gandalf wanted. Denethor would have turned out better if he had listened to Gandalf. All these characters that are the victims in Gandalf's schemes actually turn out better, or would have turned out better, for listening to him. So this criticism just falls flat. I mean, it really does. And like I said, I don't know if this comment was based more on the movie, and it might have been a kind of trolling comment for all I know, but it at least is worth looking at, because you do get the accusation in the book itself, and you can imagine, you can kind of like dream up a case against Gandalf if you really wanted to and look at it that way. But once you recognize that he is an agent of Providence, literally, he's an agent of the Valar who was sent here for a particular job, that he is actually taking promptings from Providence, and that everybody who actually does what he wants turns out better than they would have, and everything turns out better, you just can't really make any of that into, oh, it's a Machiavellian scheme and Gandalf is a bad guy. It just doesn't work. That doesn't fly. So I hope this discussion of this was interesting, at least, and maybe informative as well. If you did enjoy it, please do give it a thumbs up, share it around. Make sure you subscribe if you want to catch my future content. If you're on YouTube, click the bell icon and make sure you hit all so you don't miss any of the future videos and notifications for those. Follow me on the platform formerly known as Twitter to catch Tolkien-related trivia questions every week, and check out the other support and social links in the description below. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namarie. Thanks to all my channel supporters, especially elf friends Nathan Dufour, Robert Kindling, and Stephen Clayton.